the Delius Trust.
This is where it all is.
It's the first time we've actually had a quartet come to look at the manuscripts and talk to us.
As far as his nationality is concerned, I'm always fascinated by this because most people in Britain think of him as English,
That's right.
and we
Yes.
we always have done. I mean, when we started playing the piece, but I mean, I discovered recently about his basically German origins.
Yes, I don't consider myself a British composer, he said.
Yeah, it's a faster tempo from there, you see. It moves into the faster tempo. Please, could the accompaniment not be too loud, the horns and trombones and things. But please, seconds and violas, could it be much heavier, please? And...
I think that the wonderful thing about Delius's music in general is his ability to paint nature in all its facets and in so many different facets. I mean, when you think of the great variety of nature paintings in his music and of people, of different peoples, he was remarkable the way he could evoke the spirit of the Negro music. Isn't it extraordinary how that tune in the Florida Suite is so like I've Got Plenty of Nothing in Porgy and Bess, and yet, of course, Delius wrote that long before Gershwin, I mean 40 years or so before Gershwin.
Frederick Delius had the good luck throughout his life to meet the very people he needed at crucial stages in his career. His music had great impact in Germany, where many first performances took place. Then in England, the legendary conductor Thomas Beecham discovered Delius and became his champion. He performed and recorded a large number of Delius's compositions and was also instrumental in setting up a trust after the composer's death to promote his music. Now, some 60 years later, Robert Threlfall, advisor to the Delius Trust, is putting the finishing touches to the complete edition of his music, using as his reference the scores which Beecham himself used when conducting and marked for style and interpretation.
Delius, although very accurate and punctilious with the notes of his music, was comparatively austere as regards performing indications. He put very little down as regards how to perform the music, what speed, how to balance the instruments in the orchestra, how to phrase and to shape the individual melodies. And through his life, from 1907 or 8 onwards, the last, you might say, almost 30 years of his life, he realized that Sir Thomas Beecham instinctively understood his music as nobody else.
Sir Charles Mackerras, a current champion of Delius's music, calls at the Delius Trust to look at the score of the Florida Suite.
Sir Thomas Beecham marked his interpretative hairpins and such like straight into the manuscript.
Oh, I see. So all of these, all of those are in this.
That's right.
In this score, and for instance, that is Delius, right. And that's Beecham.
Yes.
And therefore, like that.
That's typical.
He made things more practical, didn't he?
That's
he
right.
saw what Delius meant and sort of made it readable for professional people.
Yes.
I mean, for instance, I can see that beautiful melody that the oboe plays.
Frederick Delius was actually born Fritz Delius in Bradford, Yorkshire in 1862. His parents were German immigrants who had settled there and built a prosperous textile business. In the family home, musical evenings with visiting artists were a frequent occurrence. The young Fritz attended Bradford Grammar School, and in his holidays he went to watch W.G. Grace play cricket in Scarborough. Aged 18, Fritz reluctantly joined the family firm. Before long, he was sent on business trips to centres of the wool trade in Scandinavia, France and Germany. His father couldn't have anticipated that these trips would whet his son's appetite for travel. To escape the wool trade, the young Delius persuaded his father to back him as an orange planter in America. In 1884, with his partner in the enterprise, Charles Douglas, he sailed from Liverpool for New York. He started his new life by the shores of the St. Johns River at Solana Grove, Florida. In Florida, Delius realized that his true vocation was to be a composer. A chance meeting with the musician Thomas Ward in Jacksonville led to composition lessons and indirectly to a teaching job in Danville, Virginia. His father, now more anxious than ever to see his son in a respectable profession, agreed to send him to the conservatory at Leipzig. Here Delius met the Norwegian composer Edvard Grieg, who was to become a lifelong friend and supporter. Edvard Grieg persuaded Delius's father to allow Frederick to pursue a career in music. He went to stay in Paris, lodging briefly with his uncle Theodore, who introduced him to Parisian social life before he settled down independently. Eventually, he made his home in the countryside south of Paris at Grès-sur-Loing, where he was to live until his death almost 40 years later. Tragically, the last years of Delius's life were devastated by illness. The symptoms of syphilis, which he'd contracted in his 30s, recurred in his early 60s, leaving him crippled and blind. On learning that Delius was unable to write down his music unaided, Eric Fenby, a young musician from Yorkshire, volunteered to go to France to help him, taking down his music by dictation. A relationship captured so poignantly in Ken Russell's film A Song of Summer.
Now move your inner parts down a semitone. Bring the oboe in, top A, ta-ta-ta-ta, triplet on the first beat. Yes, now play it all. No, you forgot the pizzicato in the basses. Yes. That's it, Eddie, good.
Dr. Eric Fenby had been completely captivated by Delius's music when by chance he listened to On Hearing the First Cuckoo in Spring on the wireless.
Because it wasn't like any other music. It was so beautiful in the way it flowed, and it was so exquisite in the peculiar sounds too, which I had never heard all put together as they were in this particular way.
Later, Eric Fenby was to find himself in the presence of his idol, but their first meeting got off to a bad start.
I hadn't been in the house more than, I should think, a quarter of an hour when I was asked, do you have any music at Scarborough, etc., etc. And I'm afraid I stumbled on two words which I should never have done. English music. English music, he said? I've never heard of any. Don't you think that was most extraordinary of a man like that? To somebody who'd come from Yorkshire, the first time he'd ever been away, in his life, and had come to Yorkshire to help him. Goodness gracious. I thought what I do now is to go and pack. That's finished.
But Fenby stayed and worked successfully with Delius, becoming ever more aware of how his music had been influenced by his travels.
He loved America. He had a great feeling for the Negro population. Like so many things with Delius, he was able to snatch and catch and capture for himself something that nobody else seems to do. The very essence of that musical experience.
Delius often talked to Eric Fenby about his frequent visits to Norway. One of his routes would be by steamer along the coast from Bergen to Molde, taking the ferry across the fjord. From here, a horse-drawn carriage would take him up the valley through small farming communities to Lesjaskog. He would stay at a hotel and take walking tours, seeking solitude in the high mountains. In the early 1920s, he built a chalet on the hillside here, overlooking the Gudbrandsdal Valley.
Delius loved mountains, and climbing mountains too. He made it a habit of going every year and pondering his music.
It was precisely this region of Norway, the Jotunheim Mountains, the Hardangervidda, which inspired Delius to write large-scale orchestral and choral works. In 1911, he wrote The Song of the High Hills, a celebration of his love of Norway and an expression of its mountain grandeur.
See, when I went to Grey, first of all, I heard nothing but talk about Norwegian things. So that really, I started at the top of the Delius tree, so to speak, in music. The feeling for the northern countryside is there. It's absolutely remarkable, with great surging climaxes. I remember Sir Henry Wood saying, Fenby, the music of Delius is full of the most glorious things, and I never conduct that music in the Song of the High Hills without feeling the waters just running down my spine. He said, it's so incredible.
Please, the crotchets should be played as long as possible. And all the timpani rolls, please, whether marked or not, please do a bit of crescendo. They represent the wind that's blowing all the time in the hills.
The only association that most of us had had with Delius was on hearing the first Cuckoo in Spring. To come to these works, which were so huge, such big forces, was something that was a revelation to most of us. And it was so amazing that somebody of that period had the tonality and the timbre of sound that we associated with composers much later on. In that sense, also the way that you could play those passages were totally different to other composers of that period of time.
The first time I heard the Song of the High Hills, although, as with all Delius's works, I knew within about 5 bars that I was in the presence of Delius, I still thought that this was a very new world as far as he was concerned. It's almost angry sometimes. It's angular. It's often very dissonant. And these huge contemplative sections in the middle, when you can imagine you are at the top of the hill, just looking at some vast scene and feeling at one with everything in general.
Getting used to the chords, getting used to these different, in some sense, rather simplistic rhythms, but had to be absolutely accurate. So that was a big challenge for the orchestra. It's like discovering a new artist in a way, you know, it's a new colours, and that for an orchestra is always stimulating.
Delius's music has had many critics, when first performed and even today.
People who don't like Delius are always saying, why isn't it going anywhere, they're saying. And you say, why should it go anywhere? And you see this is the immovable force against the unstoppable object or something. I mean, if they cannot perceive of a contemplative mode of art, then I don't think they will understand Delius. I think it's really quite simple. It's a temperamental thing. They wonder why we're not going from the tonic to the dominant, and why we're not having a development, and why we're not reaching home, celebrating it and ending. You know, all that stuff from the Austro-German symphony, post-Haydn, post-Beethoven. Delius just does not write music like that.
Of course, Delius's music still needs the great theorist who's going to show that there is a kind of inbuilt interior system which compelled him to write in the way he did. But I'm sure it's a system that Delius was totally unaware of. And it is at the tonal magic that makes tonal music, whoever writes it and wherever it is written, gives it its direct appeal to the musical heart.
At the age of 26, Delius effectively emigrated to France. He quickly made friends in artistic and literary circles, and he lived well enough on the continued allowance from his father, enjoying the best of Parisian social life and musical events.
You see, he was a highly cultivated man, born of German parentage in Bradford, had experience of Florida in order to put a great distance between himself and his wool-broking father, a kind of emancipation. Then he goes to Leipzig, ostensibly to study music. What he does there is to meet lots of wonderful Scandinavian friends, absolutely crucial to his development. Then a love relationship with Scandinavia, where he goes for his holidays. He finds Paris through the generosity of an uncle, a kind of remittance man, who also had escaped, presumably, from the wool-broking business. And then he finds the smart set in Paris, not necessarily musicians, although he knew the younger musicians, like the young Ravel and the young Florent Schmitt, but he seeks the company of people like Edvard Munch, Strindberg, Gauguin.
Delius had come to Paris in the full knowledge, too, that if he was to let himself go into the life of Paris, well, that would be the end of composing. And I will give Delius his due, that when he went to Paris, he wrote an incredible amount of music. 3 or 4 operas. There was no slacking off. The great thing about Delius was he was a tremendous worker throughout his whole life. Whatever he may have done, he never shirked the business of writing music, because that had to be kept going at any price.
Delius composed 6 operas in all. He wrote to a friend, "I want to tread in Wagner's footsteps. For me, dramatic art is almost taking the place of religion."
The only music that we ever heard belonging to anybody else was Wagner and Götterdämmerung. We always had to have that on a Sunday afternoon if it rained.
A Village Romeo and Juliet, perhaps Delius's finest opera, was inspired by the Swiss novelist Gottfried Keller, who found a newspaper story of a young couple who had killed themselves. He placed this Shakespearean theme in the Swiss countryside, a setting which lends itself well to the recent filmed version of the opera.
And when you care to come into the world with me, the woods and dales will roam, and your merry guide I'll be. Guide the sun and moon towards the west across the sea. The waving corn, my daily bread, to strange wild music from the stream.
Keller introduces to the story the enigmatic character of the Dark Fiddler, sung here by the American baritone Thomas Hampson.
There's composers that are complex and they're difficult to learn, but and you can get very angry with the composer because you feel you're being tricked. You feel like you're being bantered about for some sort of eclectic or intellectual game that's going on, or some sort of thing that they're doing. And I don't feel that ever with Delius. I feel that the complexity comes from an innate psychology of the music.
It is remarkable that some 40 minutes of A Village Romeo and Juliet is purely orchestral music, not sung, revealing Delius's nature music at its best. It's open to speculation why Delius was attracted to this story of tragic love.
I think he would be a man fascinated by the struggle of people with fate, with their fates. People captured in one kind of life, realizing another and dreaming of yet another. I don't think Delius took life very easily. I don't think that he found life very easy. And I should have thought that would be very interesting to him to see a Keller novel like this novel, which also victimizes because of familial, fateful events that completely victimize naive, innocent people, the two children. The inability to have love, to be love, until it's too late to ever have love grow from the relationship.
Another opera, Ermelyn, is now the last major work to be prepared by Robert Threlfall for the complete edition of Delius's works.
We have Delius's manuscript, and Beecham, in his characteristic lordly way, put his blue penciling straight into the manuscript. You would, of course, be thrown out of the British Museum if you took a blue pencil into the manuscript room, let alone used it. But Beecham put his blue penciling straight into the score.
In Paris, Delius enjoyed close friendships with many painters, especially the Norwegian Edvard Munch. It was at a dinner party in Paris in 1896 that he was introduced to a young German painter, Jelka Rosen. When Jelka bought a house in Grès-sur-Loing, near the forest of Fontainebleau, Delius followed her. They eventually married and made this their home for the rest of their lives. It was to this house that Felix Abrahamian, then aged 19, made a pilgrimage to meet Delius, who was then near the end of his life.
At the age of 78, I realise I'm one of only 4 people left alive who actually visited Delius in his home at Grès-sur-Loing. I was anxious to ply him with questions. Anyhow, Mrs. Delius tactfully suggested we should wander around the garden. We saw the river, the landing stage, her summer garden full of blooms.
He had loved the garden. Oh, yes, yes. One could always tell where he was, I gather, because his only gardening activity was the use of snips, just going round snipping. She could always tell where he was.
It was magical, and you know, then I realised that this was the inspiration to a great deal of Delius's nature music. There was Florida, there was Scandinavia, there was the Yorkshire moors, but the things like Summer Night on the River, on hearing the first cuckoo in spring, in a summer garden. I'm afraid this wasn't Home County's English garden at all. This was that little corner of the Ile-de-France, which he'd made his home and where he lived and worked for some 40 years.
Late in 1914, although the war had not affected them in Grès-sur-Loing too seriously, the Deliuses felt they should leave France for their own safety. They came to England for a few months and were warmly welcomed by their many friends. Once again, a fortunate meeting gave Delius new inspiration. Thomas Beecham took him to Manchester to hear the Brahms double concerto performed by two sisters, May and Beatrice Harrison. He immediately promised to write a double concerto for them and was also inspired to write solo works for the cello.
Delius was a great admirer of the cellist Beatrice. He began the cello concerto in her garden in Surrey, and he wrote the cello sonata for her. She gave the first performance at the Wigmore Hall. She had a very consummate technique, and it may be that some of the awkwardness in these pieces is because he knew somehow she would find a way of getting around it, and I'm sure she did. And I think many orchestral players would say that in the majority of Delius' scores, they find his writing awkward for their instruments. I don't think he was a composer that was actually that bothered by that kind of thing. It was the heart and the music that was always important to Delius, not the technical side of it. I think he didn't really have much time for that. Eric Femby had actually played this sonata to Delius, and funnily enough, he played it with the Russian cellist Barjansky, whose cello I now own. So I'm playing the sonata on the very cello that Delius heard it played on. Delius has been criticised by some people for not having enough strength, but I find tremendous strength and structure in this piece. And the way that the main theme comes back at the end is absolutely wonderful.
Another work composed during the war, the Violin Concerto, broke away from the standard concerto tradition. Performed in 1919 in London, the concerto was unusually written in one continuous movement. Criticised at the time for being too rhapsodic, it's still considered not showy enough for a virtuoso performer, as Tasman Little, a young violinist who shares Delius's Yorkshire background, was to find out when she chose to perform it in a competition.
While I was at the Menuhin School, Dr. Femby gave us the most exhilarating talk on Delius, and at that point I thought, this man is amazing. He writes wonderful music, and yet people still have this strange attitude towards him. And I wanted to learn one of the violin sonatas, but my teacher didn't really want to teach it to me. And I actually had to battle quite hard to say, well, I really, really do want to learn this piece. So finally she said, oh, all right, you can learn it. But that was my first realisation that loving the music of Delius was not going to be an easy path.
Please remember in this large string section, but please very, very quiet indeed, very, very restrained. Figure 10 is a tutti. Good, so let's try figure 9, please.
Delius was a violinist, but he also was a pianist as well, but he loved the violin very much. But I'm quite certain he couldn't have taken any of this into account when he wrote the violin concerto, because really bits of it, I wonder whether he would have been able to play them himself. I'm not sure he would have done. part of the section that I call it the Ben-Hur section, because it's got a marvellous brass moment with one theme, and it's all very exciting, and I always think it's the start of a chariot race or something like that. And then I have to play quite a bravura passage. And you carry on, go way up the fiddle, and it's like anything you would find in the Tchaikovsky. The thing is that these places are so few and far between. The places that you really realise are difficult. On paper, it doesn't look that hard.
Tasman Little has a theory about a major influence on Delius's music.
I firmly believe that Delius's violin concerto contains a part of his history that is not often talked about. A lot of his music is infused with this yearning feeling, this yearning for something unattainable or something that's been lost. And I believe, having studied a certain amount of the history of Delius's early life, which a lot of people do tend to neglect, thinking only of the later part, which we know more about, when Delius was in Florida, I believe he met on this plantation a black woman with whom he fell in love. And he had a child with this woman because Percy Granger wrote a letter saying that Delius returned to Florida in 1897 to try and find his black sweetheart and the child that he had never seen. And in fact, it turned out that the black sweetheart misunderstood the reason for his return and thought that he wanted to take the child away from her. And so she fled with her 12-year-old boy. The impact of this on Delius was never to leave him, and I believe that this infuses his music totally. This was the love of his life because she was won but lost, and he never found her again. And he subsequently bought a painting by Gauguin. The title of this painting is Nevermore. And I think that Delius never got over the fact that he lost this lady that he loved very much, and his child as well.
when it came to us, it was in a paper packet on which his wife, Yelka, had written quartet, manuscript complete and sketches. So I thought we ought to keep that bit.
Yes.
Now, this was the original version of the quartet.
It's a beautiful hand, isn't it?
Oh, yes. And there's another thing, you know. They always say, of course, Delius's writing was terrible, but it isn't. It's as clear as anything, isn't it?
Another group of young musicians discovering Delius are the London-based Brindisi Quartet.
I find the style of this music actually in keeping with a lot of the post-romantic English mode of composition, the undulating, meandering chromaticisms. I find that they're quite in keeping with other composers that I've come across from Great Britain of the same period.
Some of the sounds are really sort of post-rebellion, hushed, clustered chords, you know, with his whole harmonic idiom. I think it's definitely quite French as well, and I don't think it is all that sort of namby-pamby English pastoral at all.
The sound has got to be absolutely amazing here. I mean, it's got to be like...
Did he consider himself a string player? Because he was a violinist.
Oh, yes. I think he, as much as he considers himself any sort of performer, I think there's no doubt he thought in terms of the fiddle.
Did he perform as such on the violin, or
He's said
at all?
to have played the last movement of the Mendelssohn Concerto in America.
Oh, right.
At the school that he was teaching at.
Because, I mean, there's a definite feel for...
Yes, I think for the sound, that's
Yeah.
right.
Can I just hear what it sounds like? I won't play for a few bars.
Unlike the orchestral music, in Delius's chamber music, there are none of Beecham's instructions as a guide to interpretation.
It's very ambiguous. It's not too, all we have is not too slow. That's it. I mean,
Yeah,
I don't know what that means really. It could be just
I think we're
not static.
It's obviously not particularly...
I think it is quite static though, isn't it?
Delius's music is always going somewhere. And it's where it's going that's the important thing.
Delius considered Nietzsche the only free thinker of modern times. He feels nature, said Delius, and I believe in nothing but the great forces of nature. At the height of his career, but disenchanted with the old values of Christianity, Delius wove the essence of Nietzsche's great prose poem Also sprach Zarathustra into a pagan mass, not about death, but about the great yearning of humanity, celebrating the joy of life and the eternal recurrence of all things.
There are several interesting things about the Mass of Life manuscript. First is that it starts on page 11. Anyone who hears the Mass is struck by the enormous impact of the beginning and is amazed to think that Delius originally wrote an orchestral 10-page introduction that led up to that, and he, as he realised, completely defeated the effect of the choral entry. So he just removed pages 1 to 9, stuck the title page on page 10, and it starts on page 11.
The Brighton Festival Chorus and the Brabant Orchestra from Holland recently discovered the complexities of performing Delius's A Mass of Life.
I'd always thought of the piece as a great sort of monster of the English choral repertory, but I hadn't heard it for very many years, and when I was asked if it would interest me to conduct it, I got hold of a score, and I saw something very, very different from my preconceptions. I saw immediately the great affinities with Mahler and Strauss at the turn of the century, which is indeed when the piece was written, though I didn't know that at the time.
Delius once again chose the baritone voice to convey his prophetic message that we should abandon grief and live always in joy.
It's German music through and through. It's cosmopolitan music. It's continental European music. You know, even through and through British composers sound tedious when performed in an Anglican, solid, worthy, twee way. Delius, I think, has probably suffered more than any composer in that respect, and it needs full-blooded German singing in a way. This is the first time I've sung it. I'd listened to it on recordings and thought, not terribly convinced. Both recordings that I've heard have taken things at half speed, which is a bit of a problem, actually, certainly for singers. And I think probably the reputation for it being a bit of a killer for the baritone has come from that.
You either like Delius or you don't like Delius. I think the appeal of Delius's music is something totally emotional. It either goes ping in the heart or it doesn't. Just like Mrs. Delius told me when she first went to Gray, something went ping in her heart and she knew that she and Frederick would spend the rest of their lives there.
I find Delius's music is like the air. You know, I don't find it over-sensuous. I find it packed with sense meaning, just the way you feel when you walk down the street as various things happen to you. The breeze on the cheek, the wind in the hair, the way you feel when you walk through a shadow. All that kind of thing is minutely documented in Delius's harmonic style, the way it sort of relates to a kind of rather distant main key, but never actually gets there. This is a kind of technical thing which is quite difficult to describe. Delius's music, I wouldn't actually say it's atonal, but you would certainly say that it's very ambivalent in its tonality. It's always alluding to things and never actually settling. It's in a constant hovering state, you know. I think some people just can't take that because it doesn't seem to be going anywhere in the conventional sense. It's just charting the life of the senses.
You have to be, to me, a musically, but more importantly, a spiritually connected, understanding person, a person actually trying to think about life and your existence to appreciate the music of Delius than just having a good tune go by your ear, you know? And I think that's more of a compliment and a tribute to Delius than it is, oh gee, why isn't his music more popular? I think people have got to decide to perform Delius's music more often, regardless of what sort of indications of popularity there may or may not be. This is a very important music as far as I'm concerned. And it's kind of nice to know that there's still some great music that people don't find popular, because it means they have to grow.
The orchestra, the Brabant Orchestra, who haven't played Delius before at all, so they have no preconceptions whatsoever of what the music should sound like. And they were constantly saying to me in the rehearsal, well, how long does this piece last? You know, because it seemed endless. When we got to the performance, the whole thing really sprang to life, and the players loved it.